Hey there. Welcome to episode 17 of Tell Me a True Crime Story. I'm your host, Holly. In this episode, we'll continue the story of Anthony Soule, the Cleveland Strangler. This is part 2, so if you haven't heard part 1, go back and listen to that one first. In the last episode, part 1 of the Cleveland Strangler, we talked about Anthony Soule's background and his 11 known murder victims. Thank you guys so much for being here. I hope that you and your family are happy, healthy, and together forever. Big hugs to all of you. Now, let me tell you a true crime story. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention again that among many other sources and documents, I used firsthand accounts from victims for this story from a 2016 documentary that was made about this case and other shows. The 2016 documentary is called Unseen, and you can watch it for free if you have an Amazon Prime membership. In addition to that documentary, Oxygen has 2 episodes on this case. One is on their Living with a Serial Killer series, and the other one is on Snapped. Now, let's talk about, in the last episode, we talked about the 11 murder victims of Anthony Soule and a little bit about who they were and their past, their histories, who they were growing up. Unfortunately, all of them were drug addicted and had really, really sad stories. But all of that is relevant to this case because investigators in this case say that that's the type of woman that he preyed on. He used their vices to get them into his home in order to victimize them and murder them. So now we're going to talk about the 5 women that we're aware of that happened to escape the deadly clutches of Anthony Soule. The surviving victims' accounts are very similar to one another, and they give us insight into the last moments of the women who did not make it out of his house alive and what they must have went through. Vanessa Gay said in the Unseen documentary that when she was in the depths of her drug addiction, all she could think about was crack. She sold anything of value to get money for drugs, all of the electronics, her kids' TVs, Xboxes. Her husband sold their son's bike. She said she jumped in and out of cars. She'd sleep in abandoned houses. She'd lost so much weight and had gotten so small she could wear a 10-12 in girls' clothing. She said one day she came home and all of her family was on the porch. Her cousins, her kids, even a neighbor were on the porch, and they started in on her about her drug use. She walked off, and her 10-year-old daughter followed her and laid in the middle of the street begging her mom to come home. But Vanessa said at the time her addiction was so strong she couldn't even choose her child over the dope. In September of 2008, Vanessa was 34 years old. She hadn't been home in months. She'd had a bad day that day and on this particular day because she couldn't get a hold of any drugs. She was standing outside of a bank when a man walked by and said loud enough so that she could hear him say that it was his birthday, but nobody was celebrating his birthday. She told him she didn't celebrate birthdays, but she told him happy birthday. She walked with him to his house. She got an eerie feeling when she walked in his house, and she walked up the stairs and smelled a foul odor. They walked down a hallway, and there was one room off the hallway that had plastic covering the doorway as if the room was being renovated or something. They chatted for about 10 to 15 minutes. She then asked him what they were going to do, if they were going to smoke or drink. He asked her if she had a crack pipe. She stood up and handed it to him. He lit the stem, then turned around and punched her in the face and said, "Bitch, take off your clothes." She listened and did exactly what he told her to do. She said his eyes were evil black holes. She said she was beaten and raped. He yelled at her, Bitch, scream, ain't nobody gonna hear you. He repeatedly raped her for hours and hours all through the night. While raping her, he ranted about women who'd done him wrong, women who smoked crack. He told Vanessa that she didn't deserve what he was going to do to her, that she wasn't like the others. He told her he had an insatiable sexual appetite. In the morning, she asked him if she could use the bathroom, and he said yes. As she walked to the bathroom in that room off of the hallway that had that plastic hanging in the doorway, she noticed the plastic was now rolled up. She saw something on the floor in there. It was a decomposing body with no head, propped up in a seated position and quote-unquote taped up. She did her best to remain calm. She was careful not to change her expression or demeanor when she returned from the bathroom. She did not want Anthony Soul to know that she'd seen anything. He started repeating to Vanessa, "If I let you go, you're going to tell, you're going to tell." She said, "Tell what? You might have been a little more rougher than what I'm used to, but what am I going to tell?" She managed to get him to let her leave. She made sure to walk arm in arm with him right beside him as they walked down the stairs toward the door. She said she didn't want him to get behind her, or she knew she wouldn't make it out of there. But she did make it out of his house on that Sunday morning with her life. She walked down the street with her face all beat up, limping and bleeding. She passed several people that were going to church, and they just turned their heads. Others laughed at her. No one helped Vanessa. She called the police, and they wanted her to go down to the station to file a report. Instead, she went to an abandoned house. She calls them bandos, and she slept and slept and slept. She never did go file a police report. She thought she wouldn't be believed since she was a crack addict, so she just stayed high to numb her pain. Vanessa later found out that the headless body she'd seen was her friend from the streets, LaShonda Long. LaShonda's skull was found in a red bucket in Anthony Soul's basement, but the rest of her body was never found. Gladys Wade, who was 39 years old at the time, was attacked by Anthony Soul in early December of 2008. She'd just bought beer and cigarettes at the convenience store at the corner of Imperial Avenue and East 123rd Street. Then she started walking down Imperial Avenue to go catch the bus. Anthony Soul was standing outside his house on Imperial Avenue, and he said, "Merry Christmas" to her. She didn't know him, but she returned the greeting. He invited her to have a drink with him. She said, "No thanks, I got my own," as she continued walking. She didn't know it, but he'd come up behind her. He knocked her out and grabbed her by her clothes and dragged her unconscious down the sidewalk and into his house. When she regained consciousness, she was locked in a bedroom on the 3rd floor of his home. She started screaming. Then he came in and said, "Bitch, you can scream all you want. Nobody can hear you. You about to die." He ordered her to take off her clothes and punched her in the face repeatedly. She broke away from him and ran for the back stairs, but Anthony Soul caught up with her. He was right behind her at the top of the stairs. He grabbed her and they both tumbled down the stairs. She crashed through a glass door at the bottom. He continued to attack her. She gouged his eyeballs, clawed at his face, and twisted his testicles all the way around as far as she could in an attempt to get away from him. She managed to fight him off and stumbled out the side door of his house. Gladys ran across the street to the pizza shop and told them to call the police. The manager told her she had to get out of the store because she was bleeding on the floor. Anthony Soul followed her there and said she'd stolen from him and he had to beat her ass and put her out of his house. She told the manager she didn't even know him. The manager again told her to get out of the pizza shop. She said people standing around were laughing at her and talking about her to Anthony Soul. She left and took off running and flagged down a police officer. She told the police what had happened to her. Anthony Soul was arrested but later released without charges. Gladys said the DA did not press charges due to a lack of evidence. Anthony Soul told the cops that Gladys had attacked him and he did have visible injuries because she had fought him off in self-defense. In the eyes of the DA, it was her word against his. The DA deemed her not credible. Anthony Soule went on to murder 6 more women after this attack on Gladys. Tanja Doss survived an encounter with Anthony Soule in April of 2009. At that time, she'd known him for 4 years, since 2005. They would often sit on the porch together and barbecue or play chess. She had even slept over at his house before. So on this night, she willingly went with him when he invited her to smoke crack at his house and watch an NBA basketball game on TV. When the game was over, they listened to music and talked. Anthony Soule started talking about his ex-girlfriend, Lori Frazier. He showed Tanja Lori's clothes and papers she'd left there and was supposed to return and retrieve, but she never did. He told Tanja that whenever he cared about someone, they left him. Without warning, Anthony Soule began choking Tanja. She said he choked her so hard, her eyes bulged and tears poured from her eyes. As he was choking her, he said, "You can be the next crackhead bitch dead up in the street and nobody give a fuck about you." He told her to knock 3 times on the floor if she wanted to live. She did, and he released his grip. He then slapped her across the face really hard and said, "Bitch, take off your clothes." Then he stared off into space. She laid down on the bed with her back to him, curled up in a fetal position. She was terrified of what might happen next. He did not rape her. She eventually cried herself to sleep. In the morning, she said Anthony Soule seemed to be back to his normal self. He acted as if nothing had happened. He made her a bologna sandwich. She made up a story and told Anthony Soule she had to go see her granddaughter in the hospital, and he let her leave. He even gave her a coat to wear home. She felt lucky to be alive, and she never went back there. But she didn't report it to the police. She thought it was an isolated incident fueled by drugs and alcohol. She only told the police about her ordeal after the bodies were found on his property. LaTundra Billups had been to Anthony Soule's home on several occasions before and hung out with him in his 3rd-floor attic apartment. In September of 2009, LaTundra saw Anthony Soule outside of a convenience store. He had 2 40-ounce beers, and she heard them clanking together, so she asked him if she could have some beer with him. He said, "Come on," and she accompanied him to his house on Imperial Avenue. They smoked crack and went to an empty room on the 2nd floor of his house. The only items in the room were a blanket and a piece of an extension cord, both on the floor. Anthony Soule brought a chair into the room. When they got into that room, Anthony Soule asked LaTundra to turn around. She was tipsy and just did what he asked. When she turned around, he put his hand on the back of her neck and squeezed it really hard. She turned around and pushed him. He then hit LaTundra hard in the face and ripped her shirt off. He made her remove her clothes and lay on her stomach. He then raped her. As he was raping her, he put the extension cord around her neck and choked her until she blacked out and lost consciousness. LaTundra woke up several hours later. Her neck was burning and she was wet. She sat straight up. She saw Anthony Soule sitting in front of her on the chair smoking. His eyes bulged, and she said Anthony Soule looked startled and shocked, presumably because she was still alive. He thought he'd killed her. He then told her he was going to kill her and then kill himself because he knew he was going to jail. However, she persuaded him to let her go. She told him something like, "You're not going to jail, but I'm never coming over here no more." He told her he was sorry that he'd just been going through a lot of things. She said, "Well, I ain't did nothing to you." She got dressed as he was still talking. They walked down the steps. He stood in the doorway as she walked down the driveway. She looked back a couple of times to see if he was still there, and as soon as she reached the corner, she took off running. The hospital collected sexual assault evidence, and she reported the whole incident to the police. According to LaTundra, she was not contacted by a detective until 3 weeks later. She gave a formal statement to Detective Richard Durst at the Sex Crimes Unit office on October 27, 2009. Sean Morris's nearly deadly encounter with Anthony Soule began pleasantly enough. In the early morning on October 20th, 2009, Sean Morris was drinking beer with a friend at a bus stop located at 140th Street and Kingsman Road. She saw Anthony Soule get off a bus across the street and walk to a house nearby to buy crack. He eventually walked over to where she was and began talking with her. Around 7 a.m., Sean said she needed to leave the bus stop area so her kids would not see her there drunk when they went to school. That's when Anthony Soule invited her to his house to continue drinking and to smoke crack. They walked several blocks to his house on Imperial Avenue. She hung out with him without incident for about 5 hours. They were just talking, drinking, and smoking. She said he acted like a gentleman and nothing about their time together made her feel threatened. She left his house around noon. Anthony Soule politely walked her to the door. When she realized she'd left her ID on his dresser, she went back to his house to retrieve it. When she got there, he leaned out the window and she told him she'd forgotten her ID. He told her to come up and get it. When he opened the door and she went in, his demeanor suddenly changed and he put her in a chokehold. He ordered her upstairs and to remove her clothes and lie down on her stomach. He then violently raped her. While he was raping her, he told Sean, "I hate you bitches. Look at you. You've got a husband at home and you out here in the streets. That's why I hate bitches." Her screams prompted him to get up and start closing the open windows so that no one could hear her. She noticed there was a window still open and prayed for the courage to jump from it. She prayed to God that she'd found herself in a predicament and that she would not die when she jumped from the window. She sprung up from the bed and went to the window and kicked out the screen. She climbed naked out of the window and hung by her fingertips from the window ledge. She was hoping to drop down to the ground without getting hurt. But Anthony Soule came to the window, grabbed her hands, and tried to pull her back in. When he couldn't, he, quote, shoved her down as hard as he could, end quote. Sean fell 20 feet to the concrete below and lost consciousness. Anthony Soule went outside naked and tried to drag the unconscious and bleeding Sean back into his house. People in the area heard and saw a commotion and started to gather around. The witnesses that day, who included a neighborhood property owner, City of Cleveland workers, and Fawcett Bess, owner of Best Chicken and Pizza from across the street, tried to prevent Anthony Soule from moving Sean due to the extent of her injuries. At Anthony Soule's trial, Donald Laster, who owns property on Imperial Avenue, was one of the first people to respond to the scene after Sean fell from the window. He testified that he saw Sean laying on the ground, moaning and not moving. He then saw a naked Anthony Soule come around the corner of the house, walking in a low, crouched position. Anthony Soule told Donald Laster that the woman on the ground was his wife and she fell out of the window while they were having sex. Anthony Soule tried to take Sean inside, and Donald Laster threatened him, saying, "Don't do it or I'll kick your ass." Donald Laster called 911. As the ambulance was pulling up, Anthony Soule took off with Sean, carrying her to his house. Donald Laster put his foot in the door so that Anthony Soule couldn't close the door. Donald Laster went in, along with a fireman, and Anthony Soule dropped Sean with a thud. Another witness, Leroy Bates, Sr., was in the area when Sean fell and went to the scene. He, too, was telling Anthony Soule not to move Sean. Anthony Soule told him to, quote-unquote, leave us alone. Fawcett Bess didn't see Sean fall from the window, but saw Anthony Soule naked and the naked woman. Anthony Soule kept trying to get Sean, who was unconscious, into his house. Fawcett Bess, owner of Best Chicken and Pizza, which was right across the street, ran to Anthony Soule and said, "What did you do, Anthony?" Anthony Soule replied, "It's cool." Fawcett Bess then said, "No, it's not. She's all bloody." This scene on the side of the house where Sean fell was captured on camera from the rooftop of a nearby business. The video has no sound, but jurors at Anthony Soule's trial watched the video and got to see a naked Anthony Soule approach, then stand over Sean's limp body. Someone off camera throws Anthony Soule an article of clothing or something. After a few minutes, Anthony Soule helps Sean to her feet and they walk away together. Sean was taken by ambulance to Metro Health Medical Center. Anthony Soule actually rode with her in the ambulance. He told medical personnel he was her husband. He said they'd been doing drugs and that her fall was an accident. Sean awoke 2 days later in the hospital with no memory of getting up from the ground and walking with Anthony Soule. The injuries that Sean suffered in the fall from the window were grave. She had a fractured skull, 8 broken ribs, both of her hands were broken, and had suffered an aneurysm. Sean asked a nurse in the hospital for a phone so that she could call her husband and let him know where she was. The nurse told her that her husband had ridden with her in the ambulance. She told the nurse that that man was not her husband. Sean told her family that she'd been hit by a car because she was too ashamed to tell them the truth. She did not report her assault to police because Anthony Soule had threatened to kill her if she did. 9 days after the attack on Sean Morris on Thursday, October 29, 2009, officers with the Cleveland Police Department went to 12205 Imperial Avenue with an arrest warrant for Anthony Soule for the rape of LaTundra Billups and a search warrant for his home. It was considered a high-risk warrant, so the SWAT team was going to enter and clear the home first. When there was no answer at the door, the SWAT team forced entry and did a security sweep of the residence. There were no lights on in the house, and it was difficult to find the light switches. One detective said it was like a haunted house. As they moved through the house, the smell of death became overwhelmingly intense. After sweeping the house, it was determined that Anthony Soule was not at home. 2 decomposing bodies lying face down were located in a locked room at the south end of the hallway on the 3rd floor of his house. The bodies were covered with piles of clothing, and one of them was wrapped in a black plastic trash bag up to her knees. There was a shovel lying on the floor between the 2 bodies. The windows in the room were covered with garbage bags. Then Detective Lemmy Griffin said there were mice and rat droppings and dead flies everywhere, all over the floor, as if someone had thrown a whole bag of rice all over the floor. The rodents and flies had been feeding on the bodies. The SWAT team backed out of the house and it was sealed off for the crime scene unit. Through DNA analysis, the first 2 bodies observed by the SWAT team were later determined to be the bodies of Talacia Fortson, last seen 5 months earlier in June, and Diane Turner, who went missing a month prior in September. 38-year-old Diane Turner was the last of the women to go missing in the area that were later discovered at Anthony Soule's home. A T-shirt had been used to strangle Talacia Fortson. Her body was nude from the waist down and covered by a pile of clothing. Many of her belongings were found lying around Anthony Soule's house, including her earrings, skirt, and her food stamp card. A receipt found in a trash bag on his 2nd floor balcony showed that Anthony Soule had used her food stamp card months after she went missing. Diane Turner's body was found lying next to the body of Talacia Fortson. She was face down and covered with a pile of clothing. Her legs were bagged up to her knees. She was nude from the waist down. There was no ligature and no bindings on her body. Her body was too badly decomposed to determine exactly how she died. The coroner concluded that she was killed by homicidal violence of an undetermined type. Another search warrant was obtained and carried out the next day. For this search, investigators were accompanied by personnel from the coroner's office and a cadaver dog. A body was located beneath the basement staircase, covered by plywood and a large mound of dirt. The body had been wrapped loosely in a large sheet of plastic. A shirt that had been used to gag the woman was still tied in her mouth and knotted around the back of her head. There was a green belt that had been used as a ligature still tightly coiled around her neck. Her wrists were bound with shoelaces. This body was later determined to be Janice Webb. She had been last seen on June 3, 2009, about 5 months earlier. There were 2 more bodies on the 3rd floor. One was inside of 2 black plastic bags and the other was in a crawl space beneath dirt. The body in the bag turned out to be Nancy Cobbs, who went missing in April of 2009, about 7 months earlier. There were shoelaces tied around her wrist. She also had shoelaces around her neck that had been used as a ligature. Her body had decomposed at an accelerated rate. It had been reduced to a skeleton and soft tissue and weighed only 46 pounds upon arrival at the coroner's office. The body in the crawl space was that of Tashana Culver. She went missing in June of 2008, nearly a year and a half earlier. Tashana's body was stuffed face down into a crawl space in the west wall of the front room of the house. Her hyoid bone in her neck was broken, suggesting she'd been manually strangled at one point. Her ankles were still bound with knotted rope and her wrists with rope and a brown sock. She was the only victim that was discovered fully clothed. Her body was found wrapped in several black garbage bags that were secured with duct tape. Her body was covered with dirt that had been brought up from the backyard. The cadaver dog alerted to a spot by a bush in the backyard near the back porch. Tanya Carmichael's body was discovered there in a shallow grave. Her body had been wrapped totally nude in 2 black plastic bags and a white mattress cover. A black cell phone or camera charger cord had been used as a ligature, and it was still wrapped very tightly around her neck. She'd gone missing almost a year earlier on November 10th, 2008. Another search warrant was obtained, and on November 3rd, 2009, a backhoe was brought to Anthony Soul's home to continue searching for more possible murder victims. At the time, there were more than a dozen women missing from Cleveland's District 4. A crowd gathered on the sidewalk across the street to watch. 4 more bodies were discovered in the backyard. They had all been buried about 15 to 18 inches deep in the ground. Evidently, when Anthony Soul ran out of room to bury his victims in the backyard, he just started leaving them in the house. The bodies unearthed by the backhoe were later identified to be the bodies of Michelle Mason, who'd gone missing a year earlier, Kim Yvette Smith, who'd gone missing 11 months earlier, Imelda Hunter, who'd gone missing about 6 months earlier, and Crystal Dozier, who'd gone missing in 2007, about a year and a half earlier. Michelle Mason's body was discovered lying face down and was nude from the waist down. Her body had been rolled up inside of a black comforter and an orange blanket. Then 2 plastic bags were wrapped around the blankets and secured with duct tape. There was a used condom left wrapped inside with the body. She still had a brown sock that had been used as a ligature around her neck. When Kim Yvette Smith's body was unearthed, she still had the remains of some type of cloth bindings on her wrists and ankles. Her body was covered in 3 black garbage bags, which were then wrapped in a 7-foot sheet of plastic. Her body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Therefore, the coroner could only conclude she died from undetermined homicidal violence. Just like 6 of his other victims, Imelda Amy Hunter still had the ligature she'd been strangled with around her neck. It was a shoulder strap from a bag or a briefcase. She was nude from the waist down and wrapped in multiple black garbage bags. Crystal Dozier's body was nude from the waist down and badly decomposed. Her wrists were bound above her head and her ankles were tied together with a wire cable. Some type of cloth ligature that had been used to strangle her remained on her neck, still tied and knotted. Anthony Soul had wrapped her body in 2 layers of plastic and tied it together with black coaxial-style cable and duct tape before burying it. In the basement, a human skull was found in a black plastic bag inside of a red bucket. The bucket had been chewed on by an animal. There was no decomposition tissue in the bucket, so it could not be determined when her skull had been placed there. DNA analysis later proved that the skull belonged to LaShonda Long, who'd gone missing about 15 months earlier. None of LaShonda's other body parts were located. Also on the floor in the basement were lots of cut extension cord pieces. On October 29, 2009, when police had discovered the first bodies at 12205 Imperial Avenue, one of the most massive manhunts in Cleveland history began for Anthony Soule. They wanted to locate him before Halloween, when lots of kids would be out trick-or-treating. But he hadn't left the area. He'd been sleeping in abandoned houses in the neighborhood. People on Imperial Avenue called Tressa Garrison, Anthony Soule's sister, saying that there were dead bodies in the house on Imperial. She didn't know if her brother was one of the dead people or not. But hours later, Anthony Soule called his sister Tressa during the manhunt. She lived nearby, and he told her to meet up with him. They met 2 streets over from Imperial Avenue and stood on the side of the street and talked. He said that he had something to tell her. He told her that everything that was being said about him is true. He said he didn't know why he did it. He was just all fucked up in the head. He told her he loved her and that he would call her later. He said he had to go because the police were looking for him. On Halloween morning, Saturday, October 31st, 2009, someone in the neighborhood saw Anthony Soule walking on Mount Auburn Avenue about 1 mile from his home and called the police. They'd recognized him from news reports. During his interrogation after his arrest, Anthony Soule told detectives that he choked his victims, quote-unquote, in his dreams. He said he punished the women he brought over. They were bad, he said. Court documents state that he specifically resented the fact that the quote-unquote bad women were neglecting their children while walking the streets to feed their drug habit. He said he started taking his anger out on women in the neighborhood after he and Lori broke up. He said the women reminded him of his girl, meaning Lori. Investigators wanted information from him that would help them identify the bodies at his home. He said that when he'd been at a store, he saw a flyer with one of his victims' pictures on it. It was the missing person poster for Michelle Mason. He said he felt like he knew her when he looked at it, but other than that, he didn't give investigators any names or any helpful information as to the identities of his victims. All of his victims ended up being identified through DNA analysis. Anthony Soule was held in jail on a $5 million bond. He was charged with 85 counts that included charges of murder, kidnapping, rape, and abuse of a corpse. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but later changed his plea to not guilty. His trial began on June 27, 2011. Survivors of Anthony Soule took the stand and told their stories. Sean Morris, who'd jumped out of the window to escape Anthony Soule, said that when she left the stand after testifying, she spat at Anthony Soule and called him a quote-unquote punk-ass bitch. She said she was so consumed with intense hatred for him, but has since forgiven him and let go of the anger. She's thankful that she's a survivor and not a victim. Anthony Soule was convicted on all but one of the counts against him. The sole not guilty was for a charge of aggravated robbery in which he was accused of stealing $11 from a surviving victim. On August 11, 2011, the jury recommended that Anthony Soule be put to death. Judge Dick Ambrose upheld the jury's death penalty recommendation and set Anthony Soule's execution date for October 29, 2012, the anniversary of the discovery of the first bodies in his house. But Anthony Soule appealed his conviction, and his execution date was delayed until he had exhausted all of his appeals. About 4 months after his trial ended and 2 years after the bodies of 11 women were discovered there, on Tuesday, December 6, 2011, the house at 12205 Imperial Avenue was demolished. A light rain fell, and spectators chanted, tear it down to the ground," and "Amen," and "Hallelujah." It took about 2 hours to tear it down completely. Trucks escorted by police hauled away the debris to a recycling plant where it was shredded immediately. This was to prevent anyone from taking anything from the home to keep as some type of memento. According to Reuters.com, after Anthony Soule was convicted months earlier, in July of 2011, a website was selling dirt from his yard where the victims had been buried for $25. On January 21st, 2021, Anthony Soule was moved from death row at Ohio's Chillicothe Correctional Institution to the end-of-life care unit at the Franklin Medical Center Prison Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. At 3:27 p.m. on February 6, 2021, Anthony Soule, Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction inmate number A604609, passed away at the age of 61. An Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction spokeswoman said Anthony Soule died of a terminal illness, but would not specify exactly what it was. She did say that he did not die from COVID-19. Another victim of Anthony Soule was not a living, breathing victim, but a business that was next door to his house on Imperial Avenue. For years, a rancid, putrid stench hung in the air over 123rd Avenue and Imperial Avenue. Everyone assumed it was from Ray's Sausage next door. A resident across the street from Anthony Soule called City Hall to complain about the odor. She said it smelled like a dead person or a dead animal. City inspectors visited the sausage factory, and Ray's Sausage ended up incurring nearly $30,000 worth of expenses to make changes, like putting in new sewer traps and a new ventilation system. However, nothing worked. The smell would not go away. Tressa, Anthony Soule's sister, said she'd smelled the awful smell too when she was in her brother's house. The horrible smell even permeated his clothes. He blamed it on Ray's Sausage. The family of Anthony Soule's murder victim, Crystal Dozier, filed a claim against the city of Cleveland. They were paid $2,500. The city of Cleveland also paid $1 million to the families of 6 women who fell victim to Anthony Soule, citing a botched investigation. The families of Nancy Cobbs, Talacia Fortson, Imelda Hunter, LaShonda Long, Diane Turner, and Janice Webb split the $1 million settlement equally. 2 surviving victims of Anthony Soule also sued the city of Cleveland. The city paid $260,000 to surviving victim LaTundra Billups and $40,000 to surviving victim Gladys Wade. On a very happy note, survivor LaTundra Billups went on to earn a master's degree in social work at Cleveland State University in 2016. On Saturday, November 6, 2021, a memorial called the Garden of 11 Angels was unveiled that honors the victims of Anthony Soule. Inscribed on the plaque are the words, quote, "In honor and memory of the survivors, the victims, both known and unknown, and the entire community impacted by the violent acts that transpired on Imperial Avenue," end quote. The memorial honors the women whose bodies were found hidden in and around his home, located at 12205 Imperial Avenue. The women honored are Tanya Carmichael, Nancy Cobbs, Tashana Culver, Crystal Dozier, Talacia Fortson, Imelda Hunter, LaShonda Long, Michelle Mason, Kim Yvette Smith, Diane Turner, and Janice Webb. According to an article by Hope Sloop on WKYC.com, quote, "The Garden of 11 Angels also includes more than 30 different varieties of trees, plants, and flowers to breathe life into the space once occupied by Soule's home," end quote. I wanted to mention this again really quick. There's a 2016 documentary that was made about Anthony Soule and his victims and survivors, and you'll be able to see some of the survivors and hear them tell their stories in their own words. And the documentary is called Unseen, and it's free if you have Amazon Prime. Also, Oxygen put out 2 episodes on this case, on Snapped and on Living with a Serial Killer. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Tell Me a True Crime Story. Please subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends and family about it, and share the podcast or share an episode that you loved. And I'm grateful that the podcast is growing slowly but surely because you guys are out there spreading the word. And I guess you guys like me. I hope so. I hope so because I love you guys. So follow the podcast on social media. Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok are at Tell Me a True Crime Story, and Twitter is at Tell Me a TCS Pod. I think Twitter is working on getting my account reinstated because they chopped it off because they said there was some kind of, I don't know, somebody hacked my account or something. So Twitter might not be up and running right now, but I hope that I get it back soon. I'm in contact with them. So anyway, if you would please write a review for the podcast and give it 5 stars. That really helps me out so much. And please check out my other podcast, All Available Units Respond. I have about 4 episodes on there, but I'm going to get back to that one day soon. Anyway, I truly, truly appreciate each and every one of you guys. Stay safe and tune in again next time for episode 18 when I'll tell you another true crime story. Big, big, big hugs to all of you. Bye-bye.